Hello and welcome everyone to Business Law 101 Part 2, Startup Equity Basics by Susan Morgan. I would like to give you a very quick rundown on the story of our hypo from last week. So bear with me, we are going to do this as fast as we can. So here's the story. The characters are Marta Stewardess, a graduate student at the Polytechnical College of San Francisco studying chemistry, expecting a PhD in 2 years. Her favorite movie is Sideways. Her favorite wine is Domaine du Béjart Pinot Noir, and her hobby is winemaking. Britni Spearstein is a graduate student at the Polytechnical College studying computer science and business, doing a dual major and a master's degrees, MBA and MA expected in 2022. Her favorite movie is also Sideways, and her favorite wine is a Louis Billot Perle Vin Brut. Her hobby is cooking and pairing her recipes with wine. And Myra Estefan is our third player. She is too a graduate student at a Polytechnical College studying electrical engineering. Her master's is expected right away next year. Favorite movie is Sideways. Favorite wine is a Malbec from Muscatel Vineyards. And she studies to be a sommelier, also specializing in South American wines. Their story. The story started with Marta's idea, refining the winemaking process, building a device that would continuously monitor certain key chemicals during the process. And the device would use a software algorithm that would help to determine exactly what quantities of chemicals and ingredients need to be added at what times during the process in order to achieve an optimum balanced wine. Britni and Marta worked together to refine the algorithms and develop the software code for this device. And then Myra produced a hardware design for the device, built a crude prototype of the device in the school's engineering lab. Britni then programmed this device so that the algorithm would work without any problems. And then Marta tested it on her next batch of homebrewed wine. The results were surprisingly good. The trio dubbed their device the Sideways Winemaker, and they began holding dorm parties featuring their Sideways wine made using the Sideways Winemaker. Myra even designed a cute little label presented here for the Sideways wine bottles with the letters SiWy written on it for Sideways wine. Britni created a little web page, siwy.com, where she described the delicious taste of the Sideways wine created using their Sideways Winemaker. It was a success. Word soon got around, of course, the dorm parties helped, and other amateur winemakers began asking about the Sideways Winemaker and if they could purchase one. Britni and Marta became excited about the prospect of setting up their business to manufacture and sell their Sideways winemaker. However, changes were brewing under the surface, pun intended. Myra was graduating and had a nice job offer in New York that she wanted to pursue, so she wished Britni and Marta good luck in their new venture and left. Britni and Marta scrapped together some funds on their own, received a nice $20,000 infusion from Britni's parents to start up their business. They went to the lawyers, they incorporated, and now they're talking to Susan about equity. So that lawyer is Susan Morgan, principal of Morgan Legal Services. She has over 20 years of experience in managing and counseling technology businesses and private companies. And I just cherry-picked a fact from her bio. She was the co-founder and CEO of SoftView, the company that produced Macintex, that is now known as TurboTax. And I am a huge fan of TurboTax for the last 20 years. So I'm instantly a fan of Susan. So I'm turning now the screen over to Susan. She's going to give us the advice.
Okay, good to meet you all. I'm going to share screen and bear with me, I'm new at this. So the technology. So you can all see my screen, hopefully. So startup equity
Yes,
basics.
we
Yes,
can see. Yeah,
good.
perfect.
Startup equity basics, part 2. Startup is our business law section. Marta already told you all about me. I also taught a class at Golden Gate School of Law on high-tech startups and have lectured previously. And we're going to look at this in sections. It's a lot of material. So first, an overview. What is equity? So equity is a way to represent ownership in an entity. And it's represented by units of ownership, characterized by the number and the amount and the type or class. So it comes in different flavors. Now, depending upon what entity you have, your equity will have different names. So I just have one slide on this to give you a brief overview. In partnerships, the equity holder is a partner, and the interest, the equity they hold, are percent interest or units. In limited liability companies, similarly, the equity holder is a member, but their equity is called a membership interest, percent interest, or units. Corporations, which is what we have, the equity holder are called stockholders or shareholders, and the equity they hold is stock or shares. A word about nomenclature: stockholders or shareholders, different states will use different terminology. So corporations are creatures of the state. They are formed by states. So we'll use stockholders and shareholders interchangeably in what we're talking about. Who are the owners of the corporation? The stockholders, the equity holders are the owners. What does ownership give you? Well, it gives you a right to receive distribution in a liquidation. By the word liquidation here, we mean an exit. When the corporation is acquired, is merged, or it sells its assets, and the proceeds are then distributed down to the stockholders. So that's what ownership gives you. Plus, first, after creditors are satisfied. So there's a pecking order. The corporation in a liquidation first has to use proceeds to pay all of its debts, pay all of its obligations, and only after that are the remaining, or what we call net proceeds, distributed down to the stockholders. Stockholders also have certain limited voting rights. They do not get to vote on all matters, just very specific key matters. What about control? Do the stockholders control the company? Nope. Board of directors control the company. Under the state corporation statutes, companies have to have a board, and it is the board that controls the company. The board appoints executive officers like the CEO and the CFO, and the executive officers run the daily business of the corporation. But the stockholders elect the board. So there is that final area of control that stockholders have over the corporation in that they elect the board, then they step back and the board runs the corporation. And as we said, stockholders have to approve certain significant board actions. Okay, brief summary. So we kind of sum up where we are so far. Stockholders own the company, but they only have limited control. Board of directors control the company. They appoint the executive officers, but the stockholders elect the board and are required by statute to approve certain major actions. Okay, we're going to move on to types of stocks. Stocks come in different classes, and there's two key classes: common stock. Common stock is what is typically issued to founders, and it's what Marta and Brittany are going to be issued. And employees. Common stock is usually voting, so there's voting rights. It is possible to create a class of non-voting common stock, but it's not very common, so to speak. Common stock is last in distribution. They don't have any special rights. So what does have special rights? Preferred stock. Preferred stock is the other class that is usually what's used to provide investors with equity in exchange for their investment in the company. Preferred stock will have superior rights. It will get preferences ahead of common. Preferred stock is often divided into series. So you'll see Series A preferred, Series B preferred. For each round of financing, there'll be a new series. And this is very important. Preferred stock is almost always, I'd say virtually always in our startup companies, convertible into common at the option of the holder. So the holder of preferred stock at any time can say, I want to convert my preferred into common. Okay, so what are some of the attributes of preferred stock? A key one, and probably one of the more important ones, is liquidation preference. Preferred is first to receive payments. Now, by first, we don't mean ahead of creditors. Creditors always come first. We mean once we're done with creditors and we're now distributing to stockholders, everyone doesn't get it at the same time. Preferred gets their liquidation preference first, and then any leftover, to the extent there is any, would go to common. Sometimes, and it's not at all uncommon, preferred will negotiate for certain voting rights. They'll negotiate to have a seat on the board. They'll negotiate to have certain veto power, meaning that before the board can take certain actions, they have to get the consent of the majority of the preferred, not just the majority of the outstanding. So these are negotiations as part of the financing round. Another right preferred will often negotiate for is called anti-dilution, which means that if a future financing is accomplished or stock is sold at a price that's less than what this round of preferred pays, there'll be some anti-dilution that will be provided to this preferred to make up for that. Preferred will often negotiate for participation rights so that they can participate in a future round and not get diluted, but keep their pro rata share. Information rights generally refers to financials. They'll want annual financials, quarterly financials. They want to keep track of the company. And we'll talk more about ROFR, which stands for right of first refusal over founder shares. These are the rights that preferred negotiates for. Okay, so we said preferred stock is divided into series. So each round of financing will be a new series. Series A, Series B. We have for very early stage rounds that are not very big, will sometimes be called Series C, seed round financing. Series may have different rights and preferences, and in particular, they will have different prices. So Series B will have a different price than Series A. If Series B is a higher price, that's called an up round. That's a good thing. The company is more valuable, the stock is selling at a higher price. If for some reason the company is failing to meet its milestones and investors in the next round don't want to pay as much, they think the first round was overpriced, so the second round is a lower price, that's a down round, not such a good thing. Series may also have priorities among themselves, so it's like a pecking order. So Series A, B, and C, even though they're ahead of common, they may not all take at the same time. Series A could be senior, and it gets its preference first in a distribution. Series B junior, it gets its preference second. If they are equal priority, that's called pari passu, where they take together on their preference. Okay, so quick recap. Stock can be divided into classes: preferred, class, and common. Preferred stock and common stock. Preferred stock can further be divided into series, Series A and Series B. And preferred stock has preference over common: liquidation preference, voting preference, participation rights. Series can have priorities over each other, or they can be pari passu. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about some rights to acquire equity. So these are instruments, securities that can be granted to individuals or parties that are not yet equity, but represent a right to acquire equity in the future. So what are these kinds of things and where do they come from? First is right to acquire equity from the company. So you have a right to acquire equity directly from the company. The most common of these is stock options. Stock option is essentially a right to acquire stock in the future. Warrants are very similar to stock options, a right to acquire in the future. Convertible notes are a kind of hybrid between debt and equity, where it is a note that could convert to stock in the future. So those are the rights from the company. Then there are rights to acquire equity from other holders, somebody who holds stock, and you may have a right under certain circumstance to acquire their stock. Right of first refusal, which we'll talk more about, is a right to acquire stock from a holder. And buy-sell agreements is a right to acquire or to purchase stock under certain circumstances from other holders. So these are the kinds of rights to acquire equity. Stock options. So what's the option right? It's a right to buy a specific defined set number of shares in the future at a price that we set now. So we determine the price now, even though it may be way in the future that the stock will be bought. The price is called the exercise price, or sometimes referred to as the strike price. So stock options in our nomenclature are granted under an option plan. So there's actually a defined plan that sets forth a lot of the conditions of a stock option. And that comes directly from statute. Rule 701 is the rule that defines a lot of the criteria we need to use. And the stock that's going to be granted, the stock that you're going to exercise the option for, will be common stock. Under Rule 701, only service providers are allowed to be granted options. Now, I should point out what the rule I'm referring to is a SEC, securities rule. So this is under the securities exchange laws. Only service providers can be granted stock options. These are compensatory grants. They're incentive. They're intended for employees, consultants, advisors, people providing services to the company to incentivize them. And there's often a vesting schedule that is put on these options. In other words, they vest over time, and the holder of the option can only exercise vested shares. They're earning the right to buy the shares. Vesting comes in two flavors. The most common is time-based. So over time, options vest. A typical vesting schedule in our startup companies would be 4 years, vesting each month ratably. So 1/48 of the total option grant would vest each month. Another less typical, but is used, form of vesting is a performance or milestone-based vesting, where a service provider needs to perform a certain task within a certain time. And if they meet that milestone to the satisfaction of the company within the time, then a certain number of these option shares will vest. Warrants. Okay, so what's a warrant? The warrant right is a right to buy a set number of shares in the future at a price that we're setting now. If this definition looks familiar, it's because it is identical to the definition we had for options. From a legal point of view, strictly, warrants and options are identical. But in usage, we use the word options to refer to those compensatory grants that are under a plan. We use the word warrants to refer to those issuances to investors who are buying in a preferred stock round, to the extent they're also getting, as a part of that round, this right. So warrants being given to investors are fully vested. There's no plan. They're not earning anything. This is part of the financing, part of the equity sweetener. In other words, we're trying to make the deal a little more palatable. Maybe the company wants to sell the stock at a certain price that the investors think is a little high, it's a little rich, they're balking. So to sweeten the deal, the company will say, well, add some warrants. You don't have to buy these now, but you can buy them later, if the company does well. So it's an equity sweetener. Sometimes warrants are also granted to other parties, like lessors or vendors. Maybe the company is negotiating to take a long-term lease for a large facility, and the owner of the building is really excited about wine, really excited about the sideways winemaker, and decides he would like to participate in the company a little bit. So he significantly reduces the cost of the lease in exchange for some warrants. When you get bank loans, a lot of times banking institutions that are making loans to startups will want to have some warrants thrown in. Okay, the third type of right to acquire equity is convertible debt. And we said it's a hybrid. It's a kind of a hybrid between debt and equity. So there is a note. It's a convertible note that's issued. So in that form, it looks like a debt, but under the circumstances, if certain circumstances are met, that note could become equity. It could convert. And the conditions to force the conversion are if a next financing occurs. Next financing will be defined in the note as company raising a certain minimum amount of dollars for a new round of financing occurring within a certain point in time. When that next financing occurs, then the note converts to the stock that's sold in the next financing. So the type of preferred stock or the series in the next financing, which is great if you do well and the next financing occurs. What if the next financing doesn't occur? Here you've got this convertible note out there and we don't have a next financing. Company doesn't get it put together. There are various ways that the note can be construed. It could become debt and become due. It could convert to common. There are other possibilities as well. Basically, what the convertible note is an instrument to bridge the gap between the money you need now, which is usually a small amount compared to the financing round you want to put together later. You need some money right away to do certain milestones, to create certain amount of development or prototypes that will then allow you to go to the investor community to obtain that bigger round of financing. So it's a bridge, and that's its purpose. And then it converts, and it often converts at a discount to induce the early investors to buy the convertible notes. Okay. Now, the other kind of rights are the rights that are not coming from the company, but coming from other holders of equity. These are stock transfer rights. And we said the first one was a right of first refusal. So this is a right to purchase pro rata shares from a founder's sale. So Britni and Marta, you're going to get issued shares in the company. Sometime down the road, if you decide you want to sell some of those shares, which is not what the investors expect to happen, they expect you to hold your shares and stay with the company. If you wanted to sell those shares, and we're not talking about a transfer to a family member, to a parent, to a sister, to children, those transfers are exempt. But an actual third-party bona fide sale, and that third party made you an offer, you would not be allowed to sell it until you went back to the investor community and said, I have this offer. Do you investors want to take it first for your pro rata share? It wouldn't be all of it, but investors would be allowed to purchase, if they wanted to, a pro rata portion of that sale. So that's a right to acquire in that circumstance. Buy-sell agreements on the buy side are a right to purchase. Again, investors' right to purchase pro rata share upon a termination. So, right of first refusals are very common. Buy-sell agreements do occur in our startup companies, but are not as common. If a buy-sell agreement is negotiated, what that means is the service provider, if they're terminated, then the investors will have the right to purchase their shares. Now, the price will be fair market value, and fair market value is generally determined either by a negotiation or an appraisal. But that's the stock transfer right. So recapping where we are, Options and warrants are a right to purchase stock in the future at a price set now. They are not equity until they're exercised. Before they're exercised, they're just a right, they're a security. Options are given to service provider, exercisable for common stock. Warrants are usually provided to investors, exercisable for preferred stock and equity sweetener as part of a round of financing. Convertible notes may convert on a futures financing, or if the financing fails to occur, may remain debt. And again, not equity until they're converted. Okay, I'm going to go quickly through this. This is talking about equity, but it's contingent, and non-equity, things that are not equity, but kind of track to equity. So first, contingent equity. This is equity that's owned, but upon certain circumstances, certain contingency, which we call trigger events, the company can grab it back, can reacquire it, and take it away from you. Company contingent rights. So the most common one that we see are company rights of repurchase. And we'll talk a little more about that. A much less common one is a company call option, which is a company's option to buy back or redeem stock that was issued, usually to investors, far less common. So what is the right of repurchase and where does it come into play? Sometimes instead of a stock option to a service provider, the service provider actually wishes to purchase shares. So they'll buy the shares, they'll own the shares, they can vote the shares, but we will have a vesting schedule on those shares because, again, we want the service provider to earn the right not to buy them, but to keep them. So the shares will vest over time. What happens when the service provider is terminated? This is the contingent event. This is the trigger. The company will have a right to repurchase unvested shares. Service provider will keep the shares that have vested at that time, but anything unvested, the company can claw back and buy back. At what price? At original cost, at the price the service provider paid. So even though the service provider is holding the shares, they don't quite get to automatically keep them. There's a contingency. And if the contingency is met, anything that's not vested can be bought back by the company. Sometimes this is referred to as a negative vesting, in that the service provider is earning the right to keep the shares they already bought. What about redemption right? So this is what we call the company call option, where the company can reacquire, buy back from investors, require the investors to sell the stock that they purchased back to the company, but not at their cost. In this case, it's at fair market value. So the stock may have increased a lot in value. The company and the investor will either negotiate what that value is, or company will go get an appraisal from an independent third party to determine the value, and company can call back and buy the stock. Typically, the conditions for the call to be able to be exercised by company is a certain time, like maybe after 5 years, or a certain event when certain things happen, the company can call this option. It's rare. You normally don't see this, but I just pointed out this so you're aware. This is another way, another right to reacquire shares, but it's very uncommon. Okay, what about non-equity? By that, we're talking about rights. These are instruments, contracts, rights that are granted, but that somehow track to equity in terms of their payouts. They don't ever become equity. They are not equity. And the most common of these, you may have heard of, is phantom units, which track to equity, get paid out on a company exit, but don't become equity. They just get payment. Stock appreciation rights, or SARs, are another form of this type of right. It gets paid out upon an exercise, but it never becomes equity. It just is the right to get a certain dollars. And I put royalties and investment contracts in here in that They are payments that our third party will receive based on certain aspects that are related to company success. So like equity, the amount that gets paid has a lot to do with the success of the company or a certain product of the company. So phantom units, these are paid out on a liquidation event. They are equal to the value of a set number of shares. Typically, for simplicity, we'll do, 10,000 phantom units would be equal in value to 10,000 shares of common stock. It's not common stock, it just is determining how the payout will be valued. On that liquidation event, that holder of the phantom unit will get the exact same amount that the holder of common stock would have gotten. But they don't hold common stock, and they never hold common stock. They just get the payment. Stock appreciation rights are paid out on an exercise, and it's the appreciation, the spread between the fair market value and the exercise price that is paid. Sometimes, and it's not uncommon, for a stock appreciation right to be granted at the same time as an actual stock option. Now, these are two separate things, the stock option and the stock and the SAR, the stock appreciation right. But when they're granted together, they're called tandem SARs. Okay, the last part of non-equity, royalties, a percentage of revenues or profits on a certain product or set of products. And these are tied to specific licenses. They're ongoing and they're related and put in an instrument that's a license. Investment contracts are similar. They're just not royalties per se, but payouts based on company meeting certain types of goals or certain events, and paid on investment fixed or increased or a percent. Because they similarly track to success of the company or certain aspects of the company, they act a little like equity, but they're not equity. Okay, so recapping, contingent equity is equity that's issued but can be taken away. Phantom units and SARs are not equity, they're never equity, they never become equity, but their payments are tracked to some equity measure. And now let's look at how we count equity. We're going to start with authorized stock. How do we account for authorized stock? First of all, how is it created? We authorize stock in the charter. The charter means the articles of incorporation or the certificate of incorporation. Different states refer to their charters in different ways. California refers to articles of incorporation. Delaware refers to certificate of incorporation. Sometimes the nomenclature we use will refer to authorized stock that is not been issued. That's just sitting out there. It's authorized but not issued. It's available for the board to issue. Sometimes we'll call these treasury shares. Okay, let's look at common stock and an example of how you would authorize common stock in your charter. This is a language you might see or something similar to this. This corporation is authorized to issue one class of stock, designated common stock. We define the class, we define its designation. The total number of shares of common stock authorized to be issued is 10 million shares. So we define the number. 10 million may seem like a lot to you, but high-tech companies will often authorize large numbers of shares because they're going to be having investors and they're going to need them going forward. Different kinds of companies would use much smaller numbers, but this is the way you would set it up. Once it's authorized, the board has the right to issue up to that number of shares of common stock. In order to authorize it, you need to go to the stockholders, the shareholders, and they have to approve these articles, this charter document, whether it's an amendment or a first draft. Either way, both board and stockholders have to approve this in order to make it happen. Once it happens, all that's needed is the board to approve the actual grants or issuances. What about preferred stock? How do we authorize that? Preferred and common have their separate language in the charter. So, example, this corporation is authorized to issue 2 classes of shares designated common and preferred. You have to distinguish them. The total number of shares of common authorized to be issued is 10 million shares. The total number of shares of preferred authorized to be issued is 5 million shares. And remember, we talked about series. If we want to designate this preferred into series, we have to specify the series and the number. So, example, 4 million of which are designated Series A preferred, 1 million of which are designated Series B preferred. So we've now authorized common and preferred and designated the preferred into 2 series. Okay, let's look at our capitalization in authorized stock. Right now, we've got 10,000 shares of common. I'm sorry, 10 million, shares of common, 4 million shares of Series A, 1 million shares of Series B authorized. How many shares of common stock can the board issue with this authorization? If you think the answer is 10 million, that's wrong. Why? The reason why has to do with something we talked about before, just briefly. Preferred is convertible to common. Remember that the holders of the preferred can convert to common at any time. So what does that mean? You need to reserve an amount of shares of common stock for that conversion, for the potential for that conversion to happen. We have 5 million shares of preferred stock, so 5 million shares of your common has to be set aside in case that preferred gets issued and those people want to convert. You can't dip into that. So all you have left is 5 million shares of common that is available for the board to issue. This has to be considered set aside for potential conversion. Okay, so recapping, all classes or series of stock have to be authorized in the charter documents. Common stock, preferred stock designated by series. Preferred stock is convertible into common. Authorized common must be reserved to cover potential preferred conversions, and the common that's actually available for issuance is thereby reduced. Okay, so we looked at how we count authorized stock. Let's look at how we count outstanding stock. How is stock actually issued? How do we issue stock? Well, we said that a board approval is required. So first the board approves an issuance of X number of shares to Y person. And then we have to have some sort of agreement to memorialize that purchase, generally called a stock purchase agreement between the company and the person purchasing the stock. And the stock has to be paid for. And the way it's paid for, or the form of payment, is called consideration. Stock has to be paid for with good consideration. Okay, so what's good? Different forms of consideration that are good include cash. Cash is always good. We love cash. And cash or cash equivalent, check, wire transfer, etc. All these liquid instruments are cash. Cancellation of debt. I mean, if there's actual bona fide debt that the company owes to a person, and instead of paying for it in cash, the company pays the same amount in stock using the value of the stock to determine how much. In cancellation of the debt, that is good consideration. Property. Property is interesting. So you have tangible and intangible. Say, for example, Marta has a computer. It's her computer. She owns it. She has it. She's going to get a new one. This one is still good. She doesn't need it anymore. So she says, I would like to give this to the company or sell this to the company in exchange for its value, its fair market value, but I don't want it in cash. I want it in stock. Okay, that's good consideration. That's tangible property. What about intangible? And intangible is probably the most important one here. So intangible property would include things like ownership of technology. So Marta and Brittany developed all of this wonderful sideways technology before the company was ever formed. Now that the company's formed, who owns it? Well, the company doesn't own it. Marta and Brittany own it. But the company needs to own it. The company can't do anything until it owns the technology. How is the company going to get ownership? Marta and Brittany need to transfer, or actually assign, all their rights to that technology into the company. All of their intellectual property related to sideways winemaker has to be transferred into the company. And often the way they'll do it is in exchange for stock. So the transfer of all these intangible rights, which is written up as a transfer, either as a separate document or within the stock purchase agreement, the transfer of that in exchange for stock is good consideration and is the most common way that founders who have been working on something before they started the company get their stock. They transfer in all the rights to the technology in exchange for the stock. And that is good consideration. Finally, past services is good consideration. Suppose we have someone who's been doing consulting work for the company for a while and nobody's paid them. There was some sort of talk about, yeah, we'll put something together. And finally, we want to recognize the value of those services by granting him stock. Well, you can do that in exchange for past services. Of course, that would be considered compensatory and taxable, but that is good consideration. What's not good consideration? Future services. You cannot grant stock for a promise to provide some service in the future and have that be good consideration. Doesn't work. And sometimes you'll see in agreements where stock purchase agreements will say that the holder, the person buying the stock, the buyer, is getting this stock in exchange for services to be rendered. That's future services, and that is not good consideration. All right, I'm going to just say a couple words about par value because we do run into it. Par value is a kind of a vestigial, somewhat arbitrary value that is set for the stock. It does not represent, or I should say nominal value, it does not represent what the stock is worth in any way, shape, or form. It's arbitrary. But if you're going to have a par value, and it could be zero, you just don't state it. If you're going to have one, it has to be stated in the charter. So when you authorize the stock and you say 10 million shares of common stock at par value of blank, you put a $sign there. That par value, if it's stated, becomes what the minimum price is. Now, the place where we see it is in companies that incorporated in Delaware. And to avoid, Delaware has a strange way, interesting way of computing their franchise tax. And it's based to some extent on the number of authorized shares, which means if you're not careful and you authorize a lot of shares, you'll be paying a huge amount of franchise tax. But Delaware has an alternative method that you can use to determine your franchise tax that brings par value in. So if you have a very low par value, 0.00001, then that brings your franchise tax down to something that's more reasonable. So that's where we use it. Capitalization. So the capitalization table or cap table is a way to show who owns what equity. And for example, we've authorized 10 million shares of common stock, and Marta and Brittany have decided that as founders, in exchange for the technology that they created, they're going to each get 2 million shares that will be issued to them. What's the outstanding stock? The total outstanding stock after this is issued is 4 million shares. What's left that's not issued, that's available to be issued, treasury shares, 6 million shares. Okay, so first question, what percent of the company do the founders own? If you'd answered 40%, that's wrong. The answer is 100%. Why? Because ownership is not based on authorized stock. It's based on outstanding stock or outstanding securities. We'll talk more about that later, but not authorized stock. Okay, so how do we look at capitalization? You remember Myra? Myra is the wonderful third founder who left to go to New York and said goodbye, good luck. Problem. Myra developed significant technology and company needs to own that. So how does company get it? What's more, company needs Myra to do some more work on the technology that she developed because there's some critical pieces company needs. So company contacts Myra and says, look, I know you've got this job, but can you spend some weekends and evenings and produce this additional thing we need and assign everything you already did into the company in exchange for 1 million shares? And Marta says, okay. Now, note that when we do this, if we do this, Marta's 1 million shares are probably going to have a vesting schedule. Why? Because we wanted to continue to provide services. So these will be subject to companies' right of repurchase, like we talked about before. Here's an example of where that kind of thing comes in. Okay, so what is the company's capitalization under this circumstance and what's left in the treasury? Okay, let's look at it in the form of a cap table, which is a way of depicting it in a layout that makes it a little easier for us to see what's going on. And here's what it looks like at this point. We got Marta, Brittany, and Myra, 2 million shares, 2 million shares, 1 million shares. Total is 5 million because the authorized doesn't count here. We're just looking at outstanding. Ownership is 40, 40, and 20. Total outstanding 100%. So that's our cap table. And this is at its simplest form. What's left in the treasury? We had 10 million authorized, 5 million is left and remains available. Okay, quick recap before the last section. Stock issuances must be approved by the board, paid for with good consideration. Ownership is based on outstanding stock, not authorized. And now the last section, hold on your hats, we're going to complicate the capitalization. How do we complicate the capitalization? We're going to add in all these rights. So far, we just have outstanding stock. We're going to add in options, warrants, convertible notes, and we're going to add in another class. We're going to add in Series A, Series B. All these things will change the cap table. So let's look first at adding in stock options. So we have authorized 1 million shares. We have outstanding 5 million total between our three founders. And now we're going to add a stock option plan. And when we create a plan, we indicate the number of shares that are to be set aside and available under the plan for the board to grant options. Okay. And we're going to set aside 1 million shares for the board to grant options. What is the company capitalization? What's available for the board? Okay, so now we have a new cap table. Let's take a look at it. This portion of the cap table, Marta, Brittany, and Myra, is exactly what we had before. But now we've added the option plan. Now the option plans is not outstanding. What's outstanding is right here. So we've added a new column called fully diluted percent. Fully diluted percent looks not only at outstanding, but it also looks at all these rights and securities like options, warrants, and so forth, and adds them in under a interpretation that says if these were in fact exercised, granted, became stock, what would it look like? The total with the plan, 6 million, changes the percent on a fully diluted basis. So fully diluted percent is a kind of a worst case scenario. It includes all the rights to acquire stock as if they were in fact exercised and acquired. So issuance of 5 million, 1 million has been reserved for the plan. Okay, what else can we do this cap table? Well, we can add a new series. We're going to add in Series A. We're going to assume that we're authorizing 5 million shares of preferred, all of which are designated Series A. So now, what do we have outstanding? We're going to assume that half of these have been issued, granted, issued, sold to investors. So 2.5 million shares of Series A are outstanding, 5 million shares of common are outstanding. Then we also have our stock option plan, which with a set aside of 1 million shares. How much common stock do we need to authorize to cover all of this? We have 5 million preferred, but how much common do we need? If you said 10 million shares, that's wrong. Why? Because remember, Series A can convert to common, and we need to reserve common shares to cover Series A conversion. So what does common need to cover? It needs to cover all 5 million shares of the Series A that's authorized, and it needs to cover the outstanding common. So, and it needs to cover the reserve under the option plan. So the total coverage is outstanding 5 million, Series A 5 million, and 1 million for the plan. The very minimum common that we need to authorize is 11 million shares. But if we did that, we wouldn't have any common available to issue for anything else. So if we want extra common, sort of a common float, we need to authorize more than 11. So let's authorize 15 million common, which will give us 4 million that's available for the board to issue. Okay, now what does the cap table look like? So we've added a few more, another column to our cap table. This is our original cap table when life was simple. Okay, here's our option plan with our fully diluted and total with the plan. But now we've added Series A, okay? And we've added a new calculation of total outstanding. And now we've divided our representation of ownership into percent class and percent outstanding. So of the common class, this is showing the percent. Of the preferred class, and we're treating it as if all of it were just one investor, this is showing the percent. But of the two together, of the total outstanding, here's your percent. And then finally, adding in your plan. So under fully diluted, we have 8.5 million fully diluted, and there's your percent. Okay, one last complication. We're almost done. We're going to add in a Series A warrant. All right, we have authorized 15 million shares of common. We have 5 million shares authorized preferred designated Series A. Outstanding common 5 million shares, Series A 2.5 million. Stock option plan, 1 million shares set aside under the plan, common. And now we're going to issue a warrant to an investor for 500,000 shares. Now, we have enough Series A authorized to do that because we only sold 2.5 million. We authorized 5 million. So we can issue this warrant. What does our company capitalization look like? And here she is. Okay. So our original capitalization when life was simple, our plan, our total with the plan, the Series A that's been issued. Now we're adding in the Series A warrant, which is a right, so it's not part of outstanding or class, but it is part of fully diluted. Our total outstanding, which is 7.5 million, that remains unchanged. We haven't changed the outstanding, but the total fully diluted instead of 8.5 is now 9 because we have to count also the warrant. So that changes the fully diluted amount. So our final recap, fully diluted percent is a worst case scenario. It treats warrants, options, convertible notes, if we had them, as if they were exercised, converted, plus everything in the pool, as if it were issued and exercised. Authorized preferred, the number of authorized preferred will affect the amount of authorized common that we have to use because preferred can convert and we have to cover it. We have to reserve common to cover the preferred. Cap table slices and dices a whole bunch of different ways. When people say, what percent do I own? Well, how do you want to count it? Percent of class, percent of the total outstanding, percent of the fully diluted. Lots of different ways to look at percent, and they're all important. And guess what? Investors will always look at fully diluted percent Investors will look at the worst case scenario when they invest in your company and will treat it as if all this stuff was out there, which of course reduces what they pay for their shares. Okay. Any questions? I don't know if there were any. And Annie, if you want to stop sharing screen, I guess we could do that. I can't hear you, so.
Let me stop sharing screen.
Great, thank you.
There we go. Screen is
So that was
shared.
kind of a quick romp.
I don't see any questions in the chat. So I think you were quite exhaustive in your explanations. I probably have to listen to this all over again.
Yeah.
I'm not
Right.
surprised. We
Yeah.
covered a lot on a high level, but
Right.
it,
Well, thank you for this very good overview. I'm so glad I stayed sober for this